The Murder of Kelly and Bates. Manchester, an industrial city in the northwest of England, had long been synonymous with grit and resilience. With a history steeped in the rise of the cotton industry and the Industrial Revolution, the city had earned its reputation as a center of hard work and determination. But by the 1990s, Manchester had also gained another, more sinister distinction. While the factories and warehouses still stood, the city's streets became known for a different kind of labor, violence. Gang warfare was rampant during this time, and the streets of Manchester were no strangers to deadly shootouts. Rival gangs fought over turf, drugs, and control, creating an undercurrent of fear that echoed through neighborhoods, from the working-class districts to the more affluent areas. The crime rate soared, particularly in the late 1990s, when gun-related incidents became an alarming trend. Gun violence was relatively rare in the United Kingdom, and to see such brazen acts of crime in a city that had long prided itself on its working-class ethos left many residents feeling vulnerable and unsafe. It wasn't just gangsters and criminals who found themselves caught in the crossfire. Innocent bystanders also became victims, and the very fabric of the city seemed to tear apart at the seams. Yet, amidst this escalating violence, something far darker and far more personal was taking shape in Manchester. While the headlines focused on gang wars and the rising gun crimes, a quiet and sinister tragedy was unfolding behind closed doors. It was a crime that would send shockwaves through the city and, in many ways, change the way people viewed safety in even the most seemingly peaceful parts of the city. The story of 16-year-old Kelly and Bates would come to overshadow even the infamous gang violence, as it revealed an unimaginable horror that no one could have predicted. Kelly was a teenager like many others. She lived with her family in a middle-class neighborhood, attending school and hanging out with her friends. Described as intelligent, warm-hearted, and loving, Kelly was the kind of girl who had her whole life ahead of her. She was close to her family and was generally well-behaved, though, like many teenagers, she had a streak of rebellion. It was in this period of adolescence that Kelly's life would take a tragic and irreversible turn. In the early 1990s, Kelly met James Patterson, a man much older than her, who was to become the architect of her horrific fate. At first, her parents didn't think much of the relationship. Like many parents, they were wary of their daughter's choice of friends and boyfriends, but they had no reason to suspect that Patterson was a predator in disguise. He was a man in his 40s, by all outward appearances, a normal, respectable man. He had a steady job, kept his home immaculate, and maintained a clean, well-groomed appearance. Patterson's demeanor hid a dark secret, though. Beneath the facade of normalcy, he was a man with a dangerous obsession, a predator who would go to extreme lengths to control and manipulate the women he preyed upon. Kelly's parents, who had always been protective of their daughter, began to notice small changes in Kelly's behavior after she started spending more time with Patterson. She became secretive and withdrawn, and she would occasionally show signs of bruising that she could not explain. It was then that they began to suspect something was wrong. But Kelly, ever the teenager trying to assert her independence, brushed off their concerns. After all, Patterson was much older than her, and her parents could never fully comprehend the depth of the manipulation and control he was exerting over her. As the months passed, Kelly's relationship with Patterson deepened. Despite the growing concerns from her family, Kelly moved in with him, cutting herself off from her parents. She had convinced herself that she was in love and that Patterson, despite his age, was the one she wanted to be with. Her parents, though worried, didn't want to push her further away, and so they reluctantly allowed her to make her own choices, hoping that she would return home when she was ready. However, they had no idea that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in Kelly's tragic death. During the first few months of 1996, Patterson's true nature began to reveal itself. What started as a seemingly innocent relationship quickly descended into a nightmare. He began to abuse Kelly physically and emotionally. His control over her tightened as he manipulated her into staying with him, cutting her off from her family and friends. Kelly's once vibrant spirit slowly began to fade as she became more isolated and subjugated to Patterson's twisted desires. It wasn't long before Kelly's parents, who had been trying to reach out to her, grew increasingly concerned. They hadn't heard from her in weeks, and her calls were left unanswered. They knew something was terribly wrong, but by the time they realized the full extent of her suffering, it was too late. They received a wedding anniversary card in March of 1996, signed with no name. At first it seemed harmless, a thoughtful gesture from their daughter. But the absence of her name raised red flags. The Bates family tried to reach Kelly by phone again and again, but their calls went unanswered. Something was horribly amiss, and they feared the worst. What they didn't know was that Kelly was enduring a month of unspeakable torture at Patterson's hands. During this time, Patterson carried on with his normal life, going to work, shopping, and even interacting with others in public, all while he was systematically tormenting Kelly behind closed doors. The abuse was unrelenting, and Kelly's body bore the evidence of his cruelty: bruises, burns, and lacerations. He subjected her to beatings, stabbings, and even mutilations. For a month, Kelly was trapped in a nightmare of violence and terror with no way out. The details of her final days were so horrific that they would haunt the city of Manchester for years to come. By the time Kelly's body was discovered in Patterson's home in April 1996, the crime was so grotesque that it sent shockwaves through the entire nation. This was not just another case of gang violence or a random act of crime. It was the premeditated, sadistic murder of a young girl by a man who had expertly hidden his dark nature from the world. For many, the story of Kelly and Bates became a symbol of the darkest side of human nature, and it left a scar on Manchester that would never fully heal. The terror of Kelly's final days would overshadow the city's notorious gang wars, as the people of Manchester struggled to comprehend how such a brutal crime could occur in their midst. James Patterson appeared on the surface to be the kind of man one would overlook in a crowd, neatly dressed, well-groomed, and seemingly harmless. In his early 40s, he lived a life that many would consider ordinary. He held down a steady job, worked diligently, and kept his home impeccably tidy, presenting himself as a man with his life together. To the outside world, Patterson was the embodiment of normalcy and stability. His neighbors and acquaintances would have no reason to suspect the terrifying darkness that lurked behind his calm demeanor. However, beneath the facade of an everyday man, Patterson was anything but normal. What most people didn't know was that Patterson had a sinister past, one that he had skillfully hidden from view. His previous relationships painted a disturbing picture of a man with an insatiable need for control, power, and violence. While he portrayed himself as a respectful and responsible member of society, in reality, he was a sadistic predator who preyed upon vulnerable young women, manipulating them into his web of abuse. His ex-wife, who had once trusted him and married him, was the first to fall victim to his terrifying behavior. Their marriage, which had lasted for 10 years, had been marred by relentless psychological and physical abuse. Patterson would often belittle and terrorize her, breaking her spirit with every cruel word and action. His ex-wife finally could no longer bear the constant torment, and in 1980, she divorced him, hoping to escape the nightmare that had been her life with him. But Patterson's violent tendencies were not confined to just one relationship. In fact, the end of his marriage marked the beginning of his search for new victims younger and more vulnerable than his ex-wife had been. He was not a man to take rejection lightly. Instead, he became even more determined to find someone he could dominate and control. Patterson's attention shifted to young girls and women, individuals who were far less likely to challenge him, making them perfect prey for his twisted desires. In the early 1980s, Patterson began a long-term relationship with a woman who was 20 years his junior. Despite the age gap, Patterson worked his charm, seducing her into a relationship that quickly became abusive. This was not love or affection, but a cruel and calculated manipulation to assert his dominance over her. He would beat her when he didn't get his way, and the relationship quickly descended into violence. The abuse escalated to the point where Patterson attempted to drown her in a bathtub, a violent act that would later become a pattern in his relationships. After that near-death experience, the young woman managed to break free from him, but Patterson's thirst for control was far from quenched. His need for a submissive partner continued, and he quickly moved on to other victims, each younger and more impressionable than the last. The pattern of abuse continued throughout the late 1980s when Patterson entered into a relationship with a 15-year-old girl. Again, he managed to manipulate and dominate her, using violence as a tool to keep her under his control. He beat the girl regularly, subjected her to emotional torment, and even attempted to drown her in a kitchen sink, an act eerily similar to his previous abuse. Though the girl survived the horrific assault, Patterson faced no legal consequences for his actions. The girl, terrified and traumatized by the abuse she endured, did not come forward, and so Patterson continued his reign of terror unchecked. It was this ability to avoid justice that allowed Patterson to continue his reign of terror, unchecked and undeterred by the broken lives he left behind. He had learned how to avoid detection, how to manipulate his victims into silence, and how to continue his pattern of abuse without facing the consequences of his actions. He had become adept at hiding behind a carefully crafted facade, presenting himself as an upstanding citizen while, in reality, he was a predator in search of fresh victims. By the time he encountered Kelly Bates, Patterson's predatory instincts had been honed to a chilling degree. He had perfected his ability to control, manipulate, and abuse young women, and he knew exactly how to lure vulnerable girls into his grasp. Kelly, at just 14 years old, was a prime target for Patterson. She was a teenager struggling with her own insecurities and desires for independence, and he was quick to exploit these vulnerabilities. When they first met, Patterson was polite, respectful, and seemingly kind, traits that would have immediately put Kelly at ease. But behind that exterior, the monster that had been lurking in Patterson for years was ready to emerge once again. At first, the relationship between Kelly and Patterson seemed harmless enough. He was careful not to raise any immediate red flags, and Kelly, like many young girls in their first relationship, was swept up in the attention and affection that Patterson showered upon her. She didn't realize that she was falling into a carefully laid trap. Patterson was a master manipulator, and he quickly gained Kelly's trust, isolating her from her family and friends. He took advantage of her naivety, convincing her that their relationship was something special, something that no one could understand. He painted himself as the person who truly cared for her, while he quietly set the stage for the torment that would follow. When Kelly's parents became aware of the relationship, they were understandably concerned. The age gap between Kelly and Patterson was significant, and they could not understand why their daughter, once so close to them, would suddenly choose to be with a man so much older. But Kelly, feeling the pull of rebellion and the allure of Patterson's attention, pushed back. She hid the bruises and wounds that began to appear on her body, brushing off their questions. Patterson, in turn, painted himself as the caring boyfriend, the one who would take care of Kelly and give her the attention she craved. It was a lie, but it was a lie that Kelly wanted to believe. The truth, however, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Patterson's ability to manipulate and control had already been proven in his previous relationships, and Kelly, tragically, would not be the exception. What started as a seemingly innocent relationship quickly turned into something much more sinister. Behind closed doors, Patterson began to show his true colors. His behavior grew more erratic and violent, and Kelly's life became a nightmare. By the time Kelly's family realized the extent of the danger she was in, it was already too late. Patterson had successfully entangled her in his web of control, and her tragic fate was sealed. Patterson's facade of normalcy had once again allowed him to slip through the cracks of society, continuing his cycle of abuse without anyone suspecting the depths of his depravity. It wasn't until Kelly's death that the world would come to understand the full extent of the horror that Patterson had inflicted on his victims over the years. His ability to maintain his facade for so long, to hide his sadistic nature behind a carefully constructed mask of normalcy, made his eventual revelation all the more horrifying. The man who appeared to be an upstanding member of society was, in fact, a monster, one who would leave a wake of broken lives and unheeded warnings in his path. At 14, Kelly Bates was, on the surface, a typical British teenager, bright, affectionate, and deeply loved by her family. She was a girl full of promise, with a bright future ahead of her. But in 1993, Kelly began to change. Her parents, Margaret and Thomas Bates, who had always been close to their daughter, noticed subtle shifts in her behavior. She became more secretive, spending increasing amounts of time away from home and showing signs of rebellion. It wasn't just a typical phase of teenage defiance. There was something deeper, more unsettling happening. Kelly, once so open and connected to her family, was pulling away, and her parents couldn't understand why. The change in Kelly's behavior became more apparent when they discovered that their daughter had become involved with someone much older. James Patterson, a man in his 40s, had entered Kelly's life, and her relationship with him quickly grew more serious, though her family remained unaware of its true nature. At first, Patterson seemed like an unassuming man, polite, respectful, and harmless. To anyone who met him, he was the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about. But as Kelly's parents soon learned, appearances can be deceiving. In the beginning, the relationship between Kelly and Patterson seemed harmless. They would meet in secret, away from her parents' watchful eyes, and Kelly would tell her family little about the man she had become so close to. She was young, impressionable, and naive, caught up in the flurry of her first relationship. For her, Patterson was someone who gave her attention, affection, and an escape from the ordinary struggles of growing up. To her, he wasn't just an older man, he was someone who understood her, who cared for her in a way she thought no one else did. Her parents, however, were growing increasingly concerned. They noticed that Kelly had begun to change in more drastic ways. She became more distant, less communicative, and occasionally even seemed fearful. It wasn't long before Margaret and Thomas realized that Patterson was not only much older than their daughter, but he was also a man with a troubling background. They were horrified to learn about his history, and the idea of their teenage daughter becoming involved with such a person filled them with dread. The age gap alone was enough to raise alarm bells, but there was something even darker about Patterson. Despite their concerns, Kelly refused to listen. She saw her relationship with Patterson as something special, something her parents would never understand. She became defensive and secretive, pushing them away as she drew closer to him. They didn't know the full extent of the relationship, but Kelly's parents sensed that it was not a healthy situation. But their daughter, who had always been so close to them, was now slipping further away. She would brush off their worries with excuses, and soon, she was spending more time with Patterson and less time at home. By early 1996, the tension between Kelly and her family had reached a breaking point. She had become more determined to live with Patterson, despite the growing concerns of her parents. In a heartbreaking moment of resignation, Kelly's parents allowed her to move in with him. They felt they had no choice but to let her make her own decisions, even though they feared the consequences. The painful truth was that they knew they could not control her anymore, not without risking losing her entirely. Kelly's decision to live with Patterson would prove to be a tragic one that would seal her fate in ways her parents could never have imagined. Once Kelly moved in with Patterson, the shift from normal teenage rebellion to something far darker became apparent. What her family hadn't known, what they couldn't have known, was that Patterson had been manipulating and controlling her for months, slowly drawing her deeper into his web. Patterson's true nature, which he had expertly hidden from Kelly's family, was beginning to emerge. He was not the kind, loving figure he had appeared to be. Instead, he was a cruel and sadistic predator, someone who thrived on domination and control. His methodical approach to isolating Kelly from her family, combined with his emotional manipulation, made her feel as if there was no way out. By the time Kelly moved into Patterson's home, she was already trapped in a nightmare she didn't know how to escape. At first, Kelly continued to present the relationship to her family as though it were normal, perhaps hoping to convince them that everything was fine. She would occasionally visit, and when her parents asked about Patterson, she would smile and brush off their concerns, trying to maintain the illusion that everything was okay. However, the truth was far from it. Behind closed doors, Patterson's behavior grew more erratic, more controlling, and more violent. Kelly began to show signs of physical abuse, but she remained silent, too afraid or ashamed to speak up. The bruises she tried to hide, the fears she couldn't mask, were signs of the horrific reality she was living with. But no one knew, not even her parents. As days passed, Kelly's physical appearance began to change. She became withdrawn, her once bright and eager demeanor replaced with a shell of the girl she had once been. Her parents, who had always been able to read their daughter's moods, became more concerned, but they had no idea how deeply Kelly was suffering. The emotional pull Patterson had on her was so strong that she found herself trapped between two worlds: the family she loved but was pushing away, and the man who had manipulated her into believing she had no choice but to stay with him. The tragic transformation of Kelly Bates from a loving, intelligent teenager to a broken young girl is one that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. She had been a victim of Patterson's calculated manipulation from the very beginning, and by the time she moved in with him, the foundation of her life had been shattered. She was alone in a world where her abuser controlled everything, from where she lived to how she thought and felt. In the weeks leading up to her death, Kelly's family remained in the dark about the true extent of her suffering. They had no idea that the girl they had once known and loved was enduring unimaginable horrors at the hands of a sadistic predator. By the time Kelly moved in with Patterson in early 1996, it was already too late. She had become a prisoner in her own life, a life that would ultimately be taken from her far too soon. Her tragic fate was sealed when she made the choice to leave the safety of her home and move into a situation that would lead to her suffering and death. In hindsight, it's clear that Kelly was a victim not only of Patterson's cruelty, but also of the vulnerabilities and confusion that come with being a teenager. She had become so entangled in Patterson's web that she could no longer see a way out, and the end result was a tragedy that would leave her family forever broken. In the early stages of their relationship, James Patterson presented himself as the epitome of the perfect boyfriend, a man who appeared loving, caring, and stable. His actions were calculated, carefully designed to create a sense of security in Kelly and make her believe that he truly cared for her. Patterson knew how to charm and manipulate, and in the beginning, his persona was flawless. He was attentive, thoughtful, and made Kelly feel special in ways that no one else had. To her, he was the answer to the longing for affection she might not have even realized she had. For Kelly, Patterson seemed like someone she could trust, someone who offered her a sense of belonging that she had been craving. However, this facade was merely a carefully crafted act, hiding the true nature of Patterson's character. Beneath the veneer of the loving boyfriend was a sadistic predator, skilled in the art of manipulation and control. Patterson's charm was not a sign of affection, but a tool used to ensnare his victims and create a dependency that made it nearly impossible for them to leave. He preyed on Kelly's vulnerability, knowing that at 14, she was still too young and inexperienced to recognize the danger in his advances. She had no idea that what seemed like kindness and love was really a methodical strategy designed to make her emotionally reliant on him. The significant age gap between them, Patterson was 46, should have been a glaring red flag for Kelly, but she didn't see it as such. For someone so young, the idea of an older man showing interest could feel flattering, and Patterson made sure to play on that. He made her feel mature, as if she were beyond her years, and made her believe that their relationship was special, that it was different from anything else she had ever experienced. The age difference seemed insignificant to her at the time, but it was precisely this gap that allowed Patterson to exert such control over her. He was experienced, manipulative, and knew exactly how to get what he wanted from her. As the relationship progressed, Patterson's true intentions became clearer, though Kelly was still too entangled in the emotional web he had spun to see the danger. He gradually began to isolate her from her family and friends, making subtle suggestions that no one understood her the way he did. He planted seeds of doubt about her parents' intentions, making her believe they were too controlling or judgmental. Slowly, Patterson started to shift Kelly's focus away from her support system and towards himself, creating a world where only he mattered. He used her insecurities against her, and as she began to pull away from her family, she became more reliant on him for emotional support. Kelly's friends and family started to notice changes in her behavior. She became more secretive and withdrawn, and her once strong connection with them seemed to wither. But every time someone expressed concern, Patterson was there to smooth things over, to convince Kelly that they were simply being overprotective or misunderstanding his intentions. He worked tirelessly to present himself as the loving, attentive boyfriend who only wanted what was best for Kelly. And because Kelly, in her naivety, trusted him, she continued to defend him, even when things started to feel wrong. She rationalized his behavior, convinced herself that she was just going through a phase and that everything would be fine. But Patterson's manipulation didn't stop with emotional isolation. He used psychological tactics to further control Kelly's actions, pushing her deeper into a corner where she felt she had no one to turn to. He was strategic in making her feel like her choices were limited, and as she became more dependent on him for emotional fulfillment, her world shrank. The power dynamic between them shifted entirely in his favor. Patterson didn't need to use brute force yet. His psychological control was enough to keep Kelly under his influence. In his mind, the relationship was never about mutual affection. It was always about dominance. His goal was to break down Kelly's sense of self and make her believe that she was nothing without him. This pattern continued until in early 1996, Patterson pushed Kelly to move in with him. It wasn't a sudden decision for Kelly. It had been a slow build-up, with Patterson weaving the idea into her mind for months. He presented it as the next logical step in their relationship, a sign of commitment and love. He made her feel that living together was an inevitable progression, and she began to believe it too. Kelly, in her youthful innocence and naivety, didn't see the move for what it truly was, a further step in Patterson's plan to isolate her completely. Moving in with him meant she would be cut off from the last vestiges of her support system. It would be the moment when her world would shrink entirely to fit within Patterson's control. And Kelly, feeling torn between her family's concerns and Patterson's promises of love and security, made the decision to leave home. Her parents, aware of Kelly's growing distance, but not fully understanding the extent of her involvement with Patterson, were devastated by the news. They knew that Kelly was changing, but they hoped that it was just a phase, something she would eventually grow out of. What they didn't know was that Kelly was being manipulated in ways they couldn't comprehend, and by the time she made the choice to move in with Patterson, it was already too late. The carefully constructed facade Patterson had built was now fully in place, and Kelly was trapped in a relationship that was anything but loving. Patterson's control over Kelly had become absolute. She no longer saw the world through the eyes of a young girl with dreams of a future. She saw it through the lens of his manipulation, and everything was filtered through his twisted perception of love. The more Kelly became enmeshed in his world, the more he could convince her that what he was doing was for her own good. He twisted the narrative, making her believe that her parents didn't understand her, that they didn't care for her the way he did. In his mind, he had succeeded. He had broken down her resistance, made her question everything she had once believed in, and now she was completely reliant on him. For Kelly, What began as a seemingly innocent relationship quickly spiraled into something far darker, and all the while, Patterson maintained the illusion of the perfect boyfriend. He manipulated her into a false sense of security, keeping up the appearance of someone who cared for her, while slowly but surely eroding her self-worth and her connection to the world outside of him. The facade he had built was not just a mask. It was a prison, and Kelly, caught in the web of his deceptive control, would soon realize that escape was impossible. As the relationship between Kelly Bates and James Patterson deepened, subtle signs of abuse began to surface, though Kelly's family had little idea of the extent of the horrors she was enduring. At first, the changes in Kelly's behavior seemed relatively minor. Her once open and affectionate demeanor shifted toward a more withdrawn and secretive nature. She became more distant, not just from her friends, but also from her parents, Margaret and Thomas Bates. What they didn't realize was that these behavioral changes were not just a phase or teenage rebellion, but were a direct result of the manipulation and control Patterson was exerting over her. Kelly's parents, deeply concerned for their daughter, began noticing physical signs of distress. Small bruises would occasionally appear on Kelly's body, and her parents, initially attributing them to clumsiness or innocent accidents, soon began to question the frequency and nature of the injuries. Margaret and Thomas, worried for Kelly's well-being, asked her about the marks, but Kelly quickly brushed off their concerns, claiming they were nothing to worry about. She insisted that everything was fine, that there was nothing to see. Kelly, trapped in the psychological grip of her abuser, felt the weight of Patterson's control over her. She didn't want to face the reality of the situation and certainly didn't want to alarm her parents, whom she knew would disapprove of her relationship with Patterson. Her parents, though concerned, respected her wish to maintain some privacy. They tried not to press her too hard, hoping that it was just a phase she would eventually grow out of. At this point, they were still unaware of the full extent of the abuse Kelly was suffering. They saw the bruises and noticed her withdrawal, but they couldn't connect the dots. The idea that their daughter might be in an abusive relationship with an older man was too painful to consider, and they didn't know how to intervene without pushing her further away. So, they allowed her the space she seemed to crave, hoping that things would resolve themselves over time. The turning point came in early 1996, when Kelly made the decision to move back in with Patterson. This time, however, things were different. Patterson's true nature, once hidden behind a facade of charm and tenderness, was beginning to reveal itself in darker, more dangerous ways. The abuse escalated significantly. Patterson no longer needed to hide his cruelty behind closed doors. He had already isolated Kelly from her family and friends, and with her back in his home, he had complete control over her. No one was around to witness the torment he inflicted. Kelly, now fully under Patterson's spell, was isolated from any outside support, making it all the easier for him to continue his reign of terror. Her parents, despite their growing concern, were still unaware of the full extent of the danger their daughter was in. They tried reaching out to Kelly by phone, but their calls went unanswered. It was as if she had vanished into the clutches of her abuser, cut off from everything and everyone who cared about her. The unanswered calls became a source of worry, but they didn't know what was truly happening behind the closed doors of Patterson's home. What they didn't realize was that Kelly was enduring unimaginable cruelty during this time, brutal physical abuse that would leave her permanently scarred, both physically and emotionally. In March of 1996, Kelly's parents received an unsigned anniversary card from their daughter. The card itself wasn't unusual. Kelly had always been thoughtful, remembering important dates and taking the time to write notes to her parents. What was strange, however, was that the card wasn't signed. Kelly had always signed her cards in the past, and the fact that this one came without her signature sent an unsettling chill down Margaret and Thomas's spines. It was as if Kelly was trying to communicate something, but was too afraid or too confused to do so directly. The card was a cryptic signal, one that her parents couldn't fully understand at the time, but it was a sign of something deeper, a sign that their daughter was in grave danger. The unanswered calls and the strange anniversary card were the first real indicators that something had gone terribly wrong. But even then, Margaret and Thomas couldn't imagine the level of abuse Kelly was facing. They were not privy to the horrors unfolding within Patterson's home, the emotional, psychological, and physical torment that Kelly was enduring. The truth was far darker than they could have ever imagined. Kelly was no longer just a rebellious teenager. She had become a victim of a sadistic predator who was slowly breaking her down, both mentally and physically. Patterson's abuse was not just limited to bruises and physical injuries. The emotional toll he inflicted on Kelly was just as devastating. He manipulated her into believing that she was worthless without him, that no one else could love her or understand her the way he did. His control over her was absolute, and Kelly began to lose her sense of self. She became completely dependent on Patterson for validation, and he used that dependence to maintain his grip on her. The psychological abuse was just as damaging as the physical violence, and it contributed to Kelly's reluctance to reach out for help. She had been conditioned to believe that her situation was normal, that Patterson's treatment of her was just a reflection of his love. Despite the physical and emotional scars, Kelly kept up the appearance of a normal relationship with Patterson. She didn't confide in her parents about the severity of the abuse, and she didn't reach out to her friends. Instead, she remained silent, hiding the true extent of her suffering behind a mask of normalcy. Her family continued to believe that it was just a phase, that Kelly would eventually return to the loving, affectionate girl they had known. But as the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the truth became clearer. Kelly was trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't escape. The longer she stayed with Patterson, the deeper she sank into his web of manipulation and control. The unanswered calls, the unsigned card, the bruises, all of these were signs of the horrific abuse Kelly was enduring. But her family remained oblivious to the true nature of her situation. They had no way of knowing that their daughter's life was in grave danger, that every moment she spent with Patterson brought her closer to an unimaginable end. The truth would only become painfully clear after it was too late, when the full extent of Patterson's cruelty was revealed, and the Bates family was left to grapple with the incomprehensible loss of their beloved daughter. In the early months of 1996, Kelly Bates made the fateful decision to return to live with James Patterson. Unbeknownst to her, this decision would lead her down a dark path from which there would be no escape. What seemed like a fresh start for the troubled young girl quickly devolved into a nightmare of unimaginable torment. The once charming and seemingly protective man she had known began to reveal the true extent of his sadistic nature. For the next month, Kelly would endure the full force of Patterson's cruelty, a period so brutal that even the most hardened investigators were shocked by the details of what she went through. From the moment Kelly returned to Patterson's home, things took a horrifying turn. Patterson's demeanor, once calculated and manipulative, turned into outright brutality. He systematically inflicted pain on Kelly, taking pleasure in her suffering and establishing a reign of terror that would destroy her physically and emotionally. It was as if he had been preparing for this moment, knowing that now he could act without interference, completely isolated from the outside world. He had already separated Kelly from her family and friends, and with her return to his home, he ensured that there would be no one to witness or stop his abuse. Patterson's abuse of Kelly was not sporadic or random. It was calculated and systematic. He used a variety of methods to torture her, each more vicious and dehumanizing than the last. Kelly was restrained in ways that left her helpless and unable to escape, often tied to radiators or bedposts for extended periods of time. These restraints not only caused physical pain but also robbed her of any sense of agency, ensuring that she was trapped in an unrelenting cycle of torment. The abuse escalated quickly. Patterson, who had long held a twisted desire for control over his victims, now had the complete upper hand. He would beat Kelly regularly, using his fists, belts, and whatever else was within reach. Her once youthful body, full of life and promise, began to show signs of extreme injury. Bruises, cuts, and abrasions became commonplace, each new wound a testament to the depth of his cruelty. But the physical beatings were only part of the horror. Patterson also resorted to more horrifying methods to further torment Kelly. He would stab her, burn her with cigarettes, and even use knives to inflict deep wounds. His actions weren't erratic or impulsive. They were deliberate, designed to cause maximum pain and humiliation. The sickening combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and emotional abuse was all part of his plan to break Kelly completely. Despite the overwhelming brutality of her suffering, Kelly's will to survive remained strong. She fought back when she could, using whatever strength she had left to resist Patterson's hold. She even managed to conceal some of her injuries, attempting to hide the extent of the damage she was enduring, perhaps in a futile hope that someone might still come to her rescue. But her chances of escape were slim, and her ability to fight back was limited by the constant control Patterson had over her. The abuse continued unabated for the entire month, each day blending into the next, with Kelly's life becoming nothing more than an endless cycle of pain and despair. What made the torment even more insidious was Patterson's ability to maintain a facade of normalcy in public. To the outside world, they were simply a couple living their lives. He, the older, more experienced man, and she, the troubled young girl caught up in a dangerous relationship. No one knew the extent of the abuse Kelly was facing, and Patterson made sure it stayed that way. When they were in public, he would act charming, even affectionate, putting on an act that masked the horrors unfolding behind closed doors. But behind the facade, Kelly was suffering in ways no one could ever have imagined. The signs of abuse were unmistakable when Kelly's body was discovered, but by then it was far too late. The post-mortem revealed over 150 injuries to her body, each one a horrific reminder of the nightmare she had been trapped in. Bruises, cuts, burns, stab wounds, and broken bones. All of these scars spoke to the sheer brutality Patterson had inflicted upon her. The injuries were consistent with a sustained, violent pattern of abuse, and the details of her suffering were so severe that it left the medical examiner shaken. Kelly had been tortured for weeks, and by the time her body was discovered, there was little left of the vibrant young girl she had once been. Kelly's ability to survive for as long as she did was a testament to her resilience. She fought both physically and emotionally to stay alive in the face of unbearable cruelty. But no matter how strong her will, Patterson's control over her was too powerful. He had broken her down slowly and methodically until she was nothing more than a shell of the person she had once been. It was clear that Kelly had suffered not just from the physical pain, but from the mental and emotional trauma Patterson had inflicted on her. She had been trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape, and her tragic death marked the end of a horrific chapter in her young life. Patterson's actions were not random acts of violence, but a calculated pattern of abuse designed to exert power over his victim. He had carefully chosen Kelly as his target, preying on her vulnerabilities and isolating her from those who might have been able to help her. His control over her was total, and the consequences of his twisted behavior were devastating. Kelly Bates became just another victim in a long line of women who had fallen prey to his manipulation and violence. But her death was different. It was a turning point that would eventually expose the true nature of James Patterson, a man whose facade of normalcy had concealed the depths of his sadistic desires. For those who knew Kelly, her tragic fate would forever be a reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface. Her death, and the horrific details that emerged in its wake, would be a painful chapter in Manchester's dark history, a reminder of how a predator could operate undetected, hiding behind the mask of an ordinary man while tormenting an innocent girl. In the end, Kelly Bates was a victim of a cruel and calculated predator, and the full extent of her suffering would not be fully understood until it was too late. When the Manchester police discovered Kelly Bates' lifeless body in 1996, they were confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. The young girl's body showed signs of extreme and sustained abuse, and it was immediately clear to investigators that she had been subjected to unthinkable cruelty. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the city, and what had seemed like a tragic and isolated case quickly became one of the most chilling and depraved murders in the region's history. The police investigation began as soon as Kelly's body was found, and the evidence that emerged was nothing short of horrifying. Upon performing the autopsy, the coroner revealed the full extent of the abuse Kelly had endured. Her body bore over 150 individual injuries, each one a testament to the sadistic nature of the man who had subjected her to such suffering. The most shocking discovery was the methodical pattern of torture that had been carried out over weeks. Kelly's body had been burned, stabbed, and mutilated in ways that defied comprehension. The physical marks on her skin were only part of the story. There were deeper, more sinister signs of neglect and deprivation. Her eyes had been gouged out, a grotesque and chilling act that only served to highlight the level of depravity involved. The police were left horrified by the viciousness of the crimes committed against her. It was clear that Kelly had been trapped in a violent and torturous cycle for weeks, and there was no escape for her. The autopsy also revealed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition, suggesting that Kelly had been deliberately deprived of food and water. These were not the injuries of a quick or isolated attack. They pointed to a sustained period of suffering, during which Patterson had exerted complete control over her. She had been tortured not just physically but mentally and emotionally, broken down over time by a man who seemed intent on destroying her in every possible way. The cruelty was beyond anything the investigators had encountered, and the sadism behind it left them speechless. It became painfully clear that this was no ordinary case of domestic violence or a heated argument gone wrong. This was the work of a deliberate and calculated predator. As the investigation unfolded, the full extent of James Patterson's role in Kelly's death began to emerge. Patterson, who had once appeared to be a mild-mannered and respectable man, was now revealed as a monster capable of unspeakable acts of violence and cruelty. His calm demeanor in the aftermath of Kelly's death was even more chilling. While the police worked tirelessly to piece together the events leading up to her death, Patterson showed no remorse for his actions. In fact, he was disturbingly indifferent to the pain he had caused. He did not break down in tears or express any regret for the suffering he had inflicted on the young girl who had trusted him. Instead, he remained composed and unaffected, as though Kelly's life meant nothing to him. This lack of remorse sent shivers down the spines of those investigating the case, reinforcing the cold-blooded nature of his crime. Patterson's behavior throughout the investigation was revealing. He attempted to maintain his facade of normalcy, just as he had done when he had first manipulated Kelly into trusting him. His calm, nonchalant attitude toward the murder was unsettling, and it became evident that he had planned Kelly's death from the beginning. It wasn't an accident or a crime of passion. It was a premeditated act of violence, one that he had carefully orchestrated in order to maintain control over Kelly and, ultimately, to extinguish her life. The more the police dug into Patterson's background, the more they realized that he had a history of abusing and manipulating young women, and that Kelly was just the latest victim in his pattern of cruelty. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that Kelly had been trapped in a nightmare, isolated from those who loved her. Her family had been concerned for her well-being in the months leading up to her death, but they had been unable to intervene. The signs of abuse were there, but Kelly had denied everything when confronted by her parents, making it impossible for them to help her. Patterson had effectively cut Kelly off from her family and friends, ensuring that she had no support system left. He had isolated her, both physically and emotionally, until she was entirely under his control. Her death marked the tragic culmination of this process of manipulation and domination. The revelation of Patterson's sadistic nature rocked the community to its core. How had someone like him, who appeared so ordinary and well-adjusted on the surface, been capable of such horrors? The question haunted everyone who learned of Kelly's fate. Patterson had carefully crafted an image of a respectable man, hiding the darkness inside him, and it was only after Kelly's death that the truth began to emerge. His history of violence toward women, which had remained hidden for so long, was now exposed for all to see. His ability to manipulate those around him, to charm and control his victims, had enabled him to operate in plain sight for years without facing any real consequences. As the details of Kelly's death were made public, the horror of the crime began to sink in. The city of Manchester, which had already been scarred by its history of gang violence and crime, now had to contend with a different kind of evil, a type of violence that was personal, calculated, and disturbingly cold. Patterson's actions were not born out of anger or rage, but were instead rooted in a twisted need for control and power. His ability to hide his true nature for so long left everyone in disbelief, and the terror of what he had done to Kelly would haunt the city for years to come. In the end, Kelly Bates' murder would go down in history as one of the most depraved and shocking crimes ever committed in Manchester. Her suffering, hidden for so long, was finally revealed through the relentless work of the investigators. But the true horror of the crime lay not just in the details of her abuse, but in the fact that it had been carried out by someone who had once been trusted and loved. James Patterson's chilling lack of remorse and the methodical nature of his cruelty marked him as a predator, a man who had no empathy, no conscience, and no regard for human life. His horrific actions would forever be etched into the memories of those who learned the truth, and the legacy of Kelly's tragic death would serve as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordinary lives. After James Patterson had committed the horrifying murder of Kelly Bates, he walked into a local police station, seemingly without a care in the world. The man responsible for such a brutal crime, who had tortured and killed a young girl, appeared disturbingly calm as he confessed to the murder. It was as though he had resigned himself to the inevitable, convinced that his actions had already set him on an irreversible path. The police were taken aback by his composed demeanor, yet his confession would ultimately prove to be the beginning of his unraveling. However, Patterson's confession was anything but straightforward. When he initially entered the police station, he tried to frame the murder as an accident. He claimed that Kelly had drowned in the bathtub, offering it as a simple, albeit bizarre, explanation for her death. This first attempt to mislead investigators, while certainly odd, was nothing more than a desperate attempt to avoid the consequences of his actions. His calmness during this confession was unsettling, as if he felt little fear or remorse for what he had done. As the police began to dig deeper, it became clear that Patterson's version of events didn't add up, and he would soon be forced to confront the undeniable truth. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. Investigators had already uncovered the horrific details of Kelly's injuries, which contradicted Patterson's claims of an accidental drowning. With his story falling apart under scrutiny, Patterson's demeanor began to shift. He quickly changed his explanation, claiming that he had acted in self-defense during an altercation with Kelly. This new version of events suggested that she had somehow provoked him into defending himself. But once again, the evidence told a very different story. The severity and methodical nature of Kelly's injuries revealed a far more sinister reality. Patterson had systematically tortured her, and there was no sign that he had been acting in self-defense. The change in his story only added to the mounting pile of evidence against him, and it became increasingly clear that he was attempting to manipulate the truth in a futile effort to mitigate his guilt. Despite Patterson's attempts to create a defense, the case against him was irrefutable. The forensic experts, medical examiners, and law enforcement officers all painted a grim picture of what had transpired inside Patterson's home. Kelly's body had been subjected to extreme torture, and the brutality of her death left no room for doubt. It wasn't a matter of self-defense or an accident. It was the calculated and deliberate murder of a young girl. Patterson had shown no remorse, and his manipulative behavior only compounded the horror of his actions. When the case finally reached trial, it became a chilling moment for the people of Manchester and beyond. The courtroom was filled with those eager to see justice served for Kelly Bates, whose life had been cut tragically short. The evidence against Patterson was overwhelming, and the details of his crimes were laid bare for all to see. Forensic experts testified about the extent of Kelly's injuries, recounting the cruel ways in which she had been beaten, stabbed, burned, and mutilated. It was a catalog of depravity, a horrifying list of torturous acts that had been inflicted upon an innocent and vulnerable young girl. The trial was a moment of reckoning, not only for Patterson, but also for the community that had been rocked by the horror of Kelly's death. The judge, after hearing the full extent of the evidence, delivered a scathing assessment of Patterson's actions. The words catalog of depravity were used to describe the extent of the violence and cruelty Patterson had subjected Kelly to. This phrase, though clinical in its wording, encapsulated the horrifying nature of the crime. The judge made it clear that Patterson's actions were premeditated and sadistic, and he was unworthy of any sympathy or leniency. Patterson's defense, that he had acted in self-defense, was swiftly rejected by the court. His attempt to justify his actions was seen for what it was, a pathetic attempt to avoid the full weight of responsibility for Kelly's death. There was no question of self-defense in this case. The evidence was far too clear, and Patterson's own words and actions during the investigation only further confirmed his guilt. The judge's ruling was decisive. James Patterson was a dangerous individual who had shown no regard for human life. His ability to manipulate, control, and abuse his victims had been laid bare for all to see. In the end, the court sentenced Patterson to a minimum of 20 years in prison. The sentence was a reflection of the extreme nature of his crimes, though for many, it seemed insufficient given the horrors he had inflicted on Kelly. The verdict did little to ease the pain and sorrow felt by Kelly's family, friends, and the community. No amount of time behind bars could ever bring her back or undo the suffering she had endured in her final months. Patterson's trial, however, had served to reveal the true extent of his cruelty, and it left a deep scar in the hearts of those who had followed the case. The trial of James Patterson became a stark reminder of the evil that can lie hidden behind a facade of normalcy. For years, Patterson had seemed like a respectable man, someone who could blend into society without raising any suspicion. He had fooled those around him, including Kelly, into believing that he cared for her. But as the truth came to light, it became evident that Patterson was not just an abuser. He was a sadistic predator who had preyed on vulnerable young women. His trial exposed the darkness that had been lurking beneath his calm exterior, and it served as a warning about the dangers of manipulation, control, and deceit. For the people of Manchester, the case of Kelly Bates and the trial of James Patterson would remain a haunting reminder of the brutality that can exist in the world. It was a tragedy that would never be forgotten, and a story that would serve as a testament to the strength of those who fight for justice, even in the face of unimaginable horror. The murder of Kelly Bates sent shockwaves through Manchester, a city already familiar with its share of violence and crime. But this crime was unlike any other the city had witnessed. The brutal nature of Kelly's murder, the prolonged torture, and the sadistic cruelty inflicted upon her was a level of horror that the community had never imagined. While gang violence and other forms of crime had long been a part of Manchester's dark history, Kelly's death brought a new kind of terror to the forefront. It wasn't just another street shooting or drug-related killing. It was a brutal, personal act of evil that unfolded in the seemingly safe confines of a home. For weeks, the media coverage of Kelly's murder dominated headlines across the region. The details of her suffering, revealed through the autopsy and the evidence presented in court, horrified the public. It wasn't just the fact that a young girl had been killed. It was the calculated, deliberate way in which she had been tortured by someone she trusted. The fact that a man in his 40s had preyed on a vulnerable teenager, manipulative and controlling her into a deadly situation, sent a chilling message to the public. Kelly's death became a symbol of the hidden dangers that could lurk in the most unexpected places, right in the heart of their homes, disguised by the false facade of normalcy. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Kelly's tragic story was not just a personal tragedy. It was a warning. For years, Manchester had been accustomed to headlines about gang warfare, drug turf battles, and the occasional random act of violence. But this case exposed a darker, more insidious side of life that many had never considered. It was not about a random act of violence. It was about the quiet manipulation of a young girl, the breakdown of her self-worth, and her eventual destruction at the hands of a man who, by all outward appearances, seemed just like any other man. The idea that someone could have so much power over another person, especially in a relationship that seemed at first so innocent, was a revelation to many. The impact of Kelly's murder reached far beyond her immediate family and friends. Her death served as a stark reminder of the dangers of abusive relationships, especially those that begin in secrecy and manipulation. Young people, especially young girls, are often vulnerable to the influence of older, controlling individuals, and the tragic circumstances surrounding Kelly's death served as a wake-up call for many. Her story became a catalyst for discussions on the importance of recognizing the signs of abuse, the dangers of controlling relationships, and the need to protect those who are most vulnerable. The legacy of Kelly Bates' murder was not just one of loss, it was one of awareness. In the wake of her death, Manchester became a city more attuned to the potential dangers that could be hiding in plain sight. Her story left a scar on the collective consciousness of the city. It sparked conversations among parents, teachers, and community leaders about how to better protect young people from falling into similar traps. There was a collective realization that, despite the rough exterior of gang violence and street crime, there were other, quieter dangers that could destroy lives just as effectively. As the years passed, Kelly's murder remained etched in the memories of Manchester's residents. Her name became synonymous with the evil that can fester behind closed doors, in relationships that seem harmless but can quickly turn deadly. The city's shock and grief were not forgotten, and Kelly's death continued to serve as a somber reminder of the importance of vigilance and compassion. The legacy of her tragic end was a city forever changed, one that would never forget the young girl who became a symbol of the dangers that lie beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike.